Chapter 3. Odjeg's Promise. The first thing Reyes saw as he crossed the castle's drawbridge and walked through the main gate was just how many dead there were. He had wrongly assumed, from all the corpses outside, that those in the castle had been dumped out there. Most of the dead were elven. The attackers had paid a heavy price for their capture of the castle. It didn't matter which way he looked, the courtyard and the battlements was covered with dead, as the killing grounds outside the castle had been. On the battlements, just to the right of the main gates, was where the main assault had taken place. That was where the Legion of the Dead, followed by the Hope, had first penetrated the castle walls and held the parapet until the rest of the assault force had reached them. Most of the dead lay there. A detail had been put to work clearing away the dead. They had built a large pyre out of items of furniture taken from the castle residency and had already disposed of many of the bodies this way. It was a long, slow job, as the soldiers put on this detail had to strip the bodies of all their worldly belongings, or at least of anything useful, before they put them on the pyre. Other than those who had been given the task of stripping and burning the dead, the elves were busy in the courtyard celebrating their victory over the human defenders. A small group, with varying levels of musical ability, had found some instruments somewhere in the residency, or maybe they had brought them with them. These musicians had formed a quick impromptu band and were attempting to play together, producing a noise that could almost be described as music. Some of the other elves were dancing to this noise, assuming that what they were doing could truly be described as dancing. There was also a lot of looting going on. There seemed to be no control on the soldiers, their officers evidently turning a blind eye as the grunts did pretty much whatever they wanted. Reyes saw one elf running across the courtyard with one of his mother's favourite silver candlesticks in his hands, the one she had kept beside her bed in the master bedchamber. Another had taken the portrait of Reyes' family from where it hung in his father's study. This elf had placed it against a bale of straw and was currently using it to practice his skill at dagger throwing. There were also a lot of barrels and crates filled with bottles. Some of the elves had evidently found the castle's wine cellar, and by the look of it they had brought up most of its contents. Reyes knew that some of that wine was very valuable. He remembered how proud his father had been when he had gotten hold of a 300-year-old bottle of Borton wine. It wasn't the sort of thing that was bought for drinking, but to have the kudos of owning. The elves didn't care about any of that. To them, it might as well have had the value of water. There was no sign of Gagara. Most of those celebrating their victory wore the bright blue uniforms of the regular army. There were a few survivors from other regiments, a handful from the Children's Brigade who were as busy getting drunk as the rest of the Elven army, and a couple of the Inquisitor mages with their bodyguards on the far side of the courtyard chatting about something. However, there was no sign of anyone living wearing the brown uniform of the Hope. It was hard to believe that of all the soldiers of the Hope, only he had survived. Reyes lifted his eyes to scan the tops of the buildings and the other battlements of the castle. Indeed, there were a number of Harpies up there, 2 on the roof of the castle residency, another on the battlements overlooking the gatehouse, and Reyes counted 3 others sitting on other parts of the castle. Not one of them was Gagara. One of those Harpies took to the air, apparently at the very moment when he looked at her. Reyes watched her for a moment, wondering if she might be coming to give him some news about Gagara, but other than a quick glance, she didn't look at him. Instead, she flew straight across to the main doors of the residency and stepped inside. Reyes ignored the Harpies. He felt it was unlikely they would be willing to help, even if he could fly up to them and ask if they'd seen his girlfriend. He did have the unnerving feeling they were watching him, though. Reyes breathed out deeply. If Gagara was here, she should have seen him come through the gate. By now, she should have landed close to him, and she should be all over him, having spent the last couple of hours or so wondering if he was even still alive. Reyes began to doubt that Gagara was even here at the castle. Maybe she was still out in the forest catching something for their meal, or maybe she was just waiting for a reasonable passage of time in case Alderman Bartonet should notice her return. He looked back at the gatehouse, hesitant to leave without checking the castle thoroughly first, and yet he was beginning to feel more and more certain that Gagara was still in the forest. There was one other possibility that bothered Reyes. Gagara had been so keen on seeing some action, he feared that she might have ignored him when he told her to keep hidden in the forest. Maybe she had joined the attack after all. Even now she could be lying on top of those battlements as dead as everyone else up there. It was something Reyes really didn't want to consider. The mere thought of the possibility sent a shiver running along his spine. No, he insisted to himself, she wouldn't be up there. She couldn't be up there. Nevertheless, he had to be sure. He began to walk slowly, almost hesitantly, towards that part of the wall. Of those that had died wearing the brown uniform of the Hope, most of them had fallen on this wall. A few had ended up on the other side of the moat, and a few had fallen into the courtyard, but most were still lying on the battlements where they had fallen. It was irritating having to walk everywhere. It made him feel incomplete. Reyes had spent a good deal of his youth walking everywhere, back before he even knew he had wings. He had managed quite easily without the ability to fly until he was well into his 6th year. However, during the last year he had gotten so used to the idea of being able to fly that the sudden loss of his wings was beginning to prove more than just slightly crippling. For example, taking wing and landing on the wall was how Reyes first thought about getting to the top of the battlements. The realization that he would have to walk to the nearest set of steps and climb up the hard way only proved just how much he missed flying. There were parts on top of the wall where the corpses were piled 3 deep. A lot of those that lay up here wore the brown uniform of the Hope, but even here there didn't seem to be enough to account for the entire regiment. What has happened to the rest of my unit? Reyes asked himself. Reyes reached for the body of one of the Harpies. She must have reached the wall and fallen here. Reyes turned her over, but he didn't recognize her. At least it wasn't Gagara. Slowly, Reyes moved to the next dead Harpy. This time he had to remove the body of an elf that had fallen across her. He shoved the elf off into the courtyard. This Harpy was Agnot, her dead eyes staring into the sky as if her death had been quite a shock. There was congealed blood on her claws and fingers. She had put up a valiant fight. Reyes reached down and closed Agnot's eyes. "Rest in peace," he muttered. Reyes climbed back to his feet, happy that at least there was no sign of Gagara up here. More and more he became certain that she had to be lurking in the forest somewhere. Briefly he glanced out across the killing fields at the forest again, in case he could see some sign of her. But there was nothing. No sign of her at all. No sign of anyone. Not even the remainder of the elven army marching south to their next target. An arrow struck the body of an elf just behind him. It struck with a loud clang as it penetrated the chainmail armour that the elf had been wearing. This startled Reyes and brought him back to the present. Almost without thinking, Reyes looked towards the source of the arrow and saw that one of the Harpies that he had seen lurking about the castle earlier had taken up a perch on the tower closest to this part of the wall. She must have flown there while he had had his mind on other things. Even as he clapped his eyes on her, she was preparing a second arrow. A second missile, this time a dart, was fired at him. This came from a different shooter. It had been fired by one of the 2 Harpies sitting on the roof of the castle's residency. Adrenaline began to flood through Reyes' system. He could feel himself shiver with both fear and excitement. Since there were dead Harpies near him, he felt sure that he would be able to find a bow fairly quickly and return fire. It had to be quick, though. He was lucky he hadn't already been struck. A quick look round revealed no sign of any such weapon. There were simply too many corpses on the wall. There was a moment of regret that he had left his own bow outside the castle. He had lost his grip on the weapon when he had been struck in the wing, and he had the nastiest feeling that it had fallen into the moat. He hadn't bothered to try and retrieve the weapon, although he still had the arrows strapped to his leg. The Harpy in the tower fired another arrow at Reyes. Had she been aiming for the trick shot, he would have been suitably impressed, as the missile struck the parapet neatly between his feet. This third miss prompted Reyes to start moving. The girl in the tower was clearly beginning to get her eye in, and if he waited for her to shoot a third time, he had little doubt that he would be dead. Reyes began to run. The nearest set of steps leading back into the courtyard would mean running towards the tower from which the Harpy was shooting at him. Reyes decided not to risk it, and began to run the other way. The nearest set of steps in the other direction was actually inside the next tower over. It began to occur to Reyes that if he could get inside, he would be safe from being shot, at least for a little while. He would still be greatly outnumbered, but it would help to even the playing field a little. One of the Harpies that had been perched on a tower over on the other side of the castle took to the air and flew across the courtyard to land on the roof of the residency. From here she prepared her bow, clearly with the intention of joining in the fun. At the same time, one of the 2 already perched on the residency, the one who hadn't yet fired a shot at Reyes, took to the air and landed on the parapet just in front of Reyes, blocking the door into the tower. The very second she landed, she raised her bow, arrow already prepared, and aimed it straight towards Reyes. At this range it was hard to believe that anyone would be able to miss. Reyes seemed to have no choice. He swung himself over the edge of the parapet until he was holding on with just his arms. It was a long way down to the ground. Once again he began to wish he hadn't lost his ability to fly. Did his assailants know he was crippled? It seemed unlikely, which might explain why there was still at least one harpy perched on a tower across the far side of the castle, ready to intercept him if he tried to flee that way. He was sure it wasn't going to take them long to realise that he couldn't fly, though. There was a large pile of corpses on the ground below the parapet. Reyes wasn't comfortable with the idea of landing on them to break his fall, but it beat getting shot. He released his grip and landed awkwardly, twisting his ankle painfully. He rolled down the pile of corpses as quickly as he could and climbed to his feet trying to run. He was able to manage little more than a weak hobble. The harpy that had landed in front of him and had blocked his path into the tower when he was on the parapet now landed by the courtyard door of the tower, blocking any thought he might have had of escaping that way. Upon landing, she fired her arrow at what was still little more than point-blank range. The arrow shot straight towards Reyes, skimming so close that had Reyes been moving just a fraction faster, he would have been struck. Reyes found it hard to believe that he wasn't dead. The girl was almost definitely a skilled huntress. How could she have missed him? He began to suspect that they weren't really trying to hit him. Reyes hobbled out into the middle of the courtyard towards the partying elves. He was certain that the Harpies wouldn't want to risk angering their allies by accidentally shooting one of them. The elves in the courtyard were cheering at what they saw as sport. "Go on," some of them were shouting. "Shoot her," or words to that effect. To a man, they all seemed to be cheering on the Harpies shooting at him. One of the elves even tried to get in Reyes' way. Reyes knocked the elf down and ducked behind a pair of wine barrels. He was safe here for a moment. The Harpies hunting him would have to reposition themselves in order to get a clear shot. Doubting that he had long, Reyes considered his ankle. Was it just twisted, or had he actually sprained it? If he had sprained it, he felt sure he could fix it with just a quick heal spell. The spell worked, and the pain in his foot began to subside quite quickly. If only the pain in his broken wing would subside enough for him to risk trying a regenerate spell. One of the Harpies chasing him had reached a position where he was no longer hidden from her. Her first arrow flew no more than a few inches over his head. Reyes climbed back to his feet and began to run. He ran towards the nearest grouping of elves, but they saw him coming and gave him a wide berth. Even at full speed, Reyes wasn't able to outrun an elf, and soon he found himself standing alone where the elves had been gathered but a moment before, arrows striking the ground just behind him. Reyes was beginning to suspect that he was being herded. The Harpies' arrows were striking strategically around him, deliberately missing him, but trying to lure him towards the residency. Perhaps he would have fallen for it if he hadn't seen one of the huntresses fly towards it earlier. What was more, Reyes was certain he knew who would be waiting for him in there. As he ran, Reyes began to look around for alternative places to hide. There had to be somewhere he could stop and make a stand. One such possibility was the hut of his old teacher and mentor Mangloss. If the mage's painting was still there on the wall of the hut, then Reyes could disappear into it, and the Harpies would never be able to find him. More missiles landed near him. They were coming thick and fast now as Reyes veered away from the direction they wanted him to go. There were 5, maybe 6 Harpies in the courtyard, taking it in turns to shoot at him. Not one of them hitting him. It was starting to become only too obvious that they were trying to get him to change direction. One arrow hit a loose rock just in front of Reyes, and instead of sticking in, it bounced across his path and threatened to trip him up. Reyes leaped over the bouncing arrow and continued to run. Harpies rarely carried more than 5 or 6 arrows at a time, so he was sure they couldn't keep this up for long. Indeed, Reyes felt certain that each of his nemesis had already fired at least that number at him. The truth was they'd only fired 3 or 4 each at the most. The arrows continued coming. Their aiming seemed a little more erratic as Reyes headed further and further away from the castle residency. He risked a quick glance behind him and saw one of the Harpies flying towards the castle residency again, no doubt to report that he had gone in totally the wrong direction. Then, as he turned his attention back to the mage's hut, he saw a Harpy land on the roof of the hut, her dart thrower aimed directly at him. Reyes was sure that even if he tried to flee, she couldn't miss him at this range, so he ran towards the hut instead. "Stay put," the girl ordered. Reyes glanced up at her but ignored her command. Instead, he pointed his shoulder at the door of the hut and charged at it. Reyes had expected the resistance of a locked door that would splinter a little as he smashed it open. As it was, the door opened easily on its hinges and did little to arrest Reyes' speed. Reyes ran on to collide with one of the 2 small tables that Mangloss had in his hut. It was dark in the hut. The place had no windows, partly because Mangloss didn't like to have people watching him while he worked, but also because glass was expensive. With the door closed, the only light was that which found its way into the hut around the edges of the door. It wasn't a lot of light, but with the help of a cat sight spell, Reyes was able to consider his position a little better. There had been a battle here. There were 2 knights lying on the floor on the far side of the tables, surrounded by about a dozen elven dead. It looked as if the 2 had fought back to back, and had put on a good display, but evidently, shortly after the first had fallen, the second had been overwhelmed, and moments later had joined his partner. Reyes thought he recognised one of the knights. It was Safolo. His armour was quite distinctive, and his face even more so. Safolo had been one of Tyr's personal bodyguard. Reyes reasoned that by extension, the other had also been a member of that noble regiment. Reyes felt his heart sink. If Tyr's bodyguard had been here, and had fought to the last man, then there was a good chance that lying somewhere else in the castle was the remains of his brother. Reyes imagined Tyr lying on the floor of the great hall, his chest pierced by an elven spear. Right now, there were other things to worry about. Reyes heard the Harpy jump off the roof. Judging by the sound, she landed beside the door and was most likely watching that door like a hawk. At least she wasn't trying to follow him inside, but to Reyes that could only mean she was waiting for her sisters to arrive. He glanced around the rest of the hut. The painting that Reyes had hoped to find here was missing. That didn't really surprise Reyes too much. Mangloss was living in Leamington now, and even though it was obvious from all the magical traps that had been placed out in the field that he had visited recently, most of his personal belongings were gone. Reyes quickly made his way over to the Major's cupboard. He knew where Mangloss usually kept his little box of knickknacks. Reyes hoped to find something in there that could help him out of this predicament. Not only was the box not there, but the entire cupboard was empty. It looked as if Mangloss had left next to nothing behind. "Tanrag," a voice shouted from outside the hut. "I told you I would personally rip your heart from your chest once the battle was over." Reyes knew that voice. He had only ever heard Odjeg speak on one occasion, but he had been pretty certain of who had been behind this attack on him. He didn't reply. Instead he looked around the hut for a weapon, and seeing nothing else, grabbed a sword from one of the fallen knights. "I thought you were already dead, Tanrag. One of my girls said she had seen you hit more than a dozen times during the battle. I stayed behind though, just in case. And now I take great pleasure in killing you myself." Reyes had the distinct impression that Odjeg was trying to goad him into leaving the hut. He could see it now. The second he stepped out of the hut, he would be riddled with arrows from the 6 or 7 Harpies that were no doubt already standing out there waiting for him. No, Reyes rejected the thought. If the other girls had been trying to kill him, he would already be dead. Odjeg wanted him for herself. Reyes knew that Harpies who lived in villages tended to put a lot of value in gaining face. There was no doubt a lot of face to be gained in killing a rival male, and Odjeg, as leader of a village, would want to make sure that she was the one to get it. The others were merely there to support their leader and to act as witnesses when she killed him. "So," Reyes shouted through the closed door, "what's the plan? I step out of the hut and you shoot me dead?" "That's pretty much it, yep," Odjeg replied. "Are you too much of a coward to take me on by yourself, claw to claw?" Reyes goaded. Odjeg laughed. It was a very ugly laugh. "What, and give up my advantage? Forget it." Reyes shrugged his shoulders. So much for that idea. It had been worth a try, and it always seemed to work in the stories his old nanny had told him when he was young. "In that case, you're going to have to come in and get me." Odjeg laughed again. "Fine." Reyes stepped back from the door and waited, his sword held tightly in his hand, ready to strike the second Odjeg, or indeed any of the Harpies laying siege to his refuge, tried to enter. It wasn't long before Reyes could hear a strange crackling sound. He glanced up as a little bit of ash began to fall from the ceiling. The Harpies had set light to the thatch on the roof of the hut. Reyes knew that the roof wouldn't take long to burn. Soon, there was going to be a hole in the thatch big enough for Odjeg to hover above and shoot through. Almost in a panic, Reyes began to consider his options. His first thought was to hide underneath one of the tables. They were thick and strong, but somehow he doubted that either of them would prove thick enough or strong enough to stop an arrow fired by a Harpy. He also realised that he would be at a great disadvantage under the table if Odjeg or any of the others should then decide to come through the door. There didn't seem to be much else Reyes could do. It was common knowledge that a harpy could shoot through the breastplate of a suit of armour with little effort, even if Reyes did have time to strip one of the knights. Not that the armour would fit him anyway. In the end, he felt that all he could do was keep as close to the door as he possibly could in order to limit Odjeg's angle of fire and hope that no one tried to shoot through the door. Reyes didn't have to wait long. Odjeg hovered for a moment over the fast-forming hole in the roof. She didn't stay there long. Reyes guessed that the heat coming off of the burning thatch must have proven too much for her. Odjeg flew towards the back of the hut. Reyes heard her land on a part of the roof that the fire hadn't yet spread to. Somehow he doubted he had long left. Already he could hear Odjeg's footsteps as she moved across the thatched roof, looking for the ideal place from which to fire the fatal shot. He had to act. While Odjeg was on the roof, the only ones out the front were the 5 or 6 harpies that had tried to herd him towards the castle's residency. 5 or 6 harpies who Reyes was certain had orders to leave the actual kill for Odjeg, and who wouldn't be ready for his attack. Reyes had been trained in the use of the sword by the best weapons trainer Floreth had to offer. He had learnt how to handle more than one opponent at a time. Anida was better though. Reyes remembered how he'd once seen Anida fight against no fewer than 8 opponents. The best Reyes had ever been able to manage was 3, but his life hadn't been on the line back then. He seemed to have little choice. The fire was spreading fast and Odjeg was going to have a clear shot at any moment. The bright sunshine was already flooding into the hut. With his cat sight enhanced eyes, the sun seemed to be blindingly bright. Ideally he would wait until his eyes had adjusted properly, but by then he was sure it would be too late. Reyes smashed the door of the hut open and charged out, his great sword swinging. The harpies seemed to be little more than darkened shadows in a bleached white world. He lashed out at the nearest of those shadows. As he cut down his first opponent, Reyes spared a moment's thought to what had happened to Anida and her father. Were they too lying in the dirt somewhere about the castle? Reyes found it hard to believe that either of them could be dead, considering just how skilled they were. Then again, one arrow could bring down the mightiest of enemies. Reyes moved swiftly. Being unable to see properly didn't seem to matter that much after all, as he struck down the second harpy before the first had even begun to fall. With so much light blinding him, it was hard to see clearly what was happening. Reyes had the distinct impression that one of the shadows was raising her bow against him, while next to her was the sound of a huntress dropping her bow. Perhaps she was preparing her claws for melee, but Reyes really couldn't be sure. Not willing to take any chances, Reyes lashed out at both of them, cutting them down in quick succession. His sword cut into harpy flesh with a satisfying thud, and the shadows, that were slowly becoming more and more harpy-like, toppled to the ground. His eyesight was slowly adjusting. The sound of 2 more bows hitting the ground was followed immediately by the sound of wings as the last 2 huntresses fled from the scene. Reyes let them go. Without their bows they weren't likely to be too much of a threat. It was likely they wouldn't have done the same for him, but his eyesight still felt a little off. Besides, Reyes had other fish to fry. Odjeg was still at large somewhere nearby. She might even still be on the roof of the mage's hut, and to Reyes, she was a far more immediate danger. Reyes pinned himself to the side of the hut and stood there, unsure what to do. He couldn't see clearly enough to hunt Odjeg down. All she would have to do was wait, bide her time, and shoot him at range. The only thing Reyes had to his advantage was that Odjeg couldn't know how blind he was at this moment. His eyesight was coming back though. The bleaching effect caused by walking out into daylight with the cat sight spell on was slowly fading, and the figures of the harpies he had just cut down were beginning to take their proper shape. If only Odjeg would give him the time he needed to recover. Somehow he doubted she would. Sooner or later Odjeg would realise something was wrong, and at that moment she would attack. On the ground, not far from where he had cut down one of the harpies, was the shape of something vaguely like a short bow. Even as he stood there looking at it, loath to move because he might give Odjeg an easy target, the shape coalesced even more into that of a bow. Reyes dropped his sword and made a grab for the bow. Then he ducked back into the relative safety of the side of the hut. Odjeg didn't fire. She must have seen Reyes cut down 4 of her friends, and was probably hiding somewhere rather than risking a direct confrontation. If he could be sure of that, then Reyes might have been willing to let it go, but then someone like Odjeg would just be waiting for the right opportunity. Reyes knocked one of his arrows to the bow and pointed it straight up. He had no idea where Odjeg might be hiding. He still couldn't see all that well, but so long as she was in range of the bow, the magic of his bracelets would mean that he really couldn't miss. Reyes fired the arrow. He didn't see it as he went straight up, nor did he see the arrow arching down slightly once it reached the apex of its flight. He didn't see, though he did hear, the arrow glancing off the wall behind the hut, and he clearly heard the pain squawk as his arrow hit the target. Odjeg fell. Reyes saw the bleak shadow of her as she fell. She had been hiding round the side of the building, hiding, or waiting for the right moment. Reyes's arrow had somehow struck her in the back of the head. Reyes breathed a sigh of relief. The fight was over, and he was still alive. Slowly he felt able to relax again. He stood there, looking at the dead harpies and waiting for his eyesight to come the rest of the way back to him. He really needed to learn not to cast that spell in darkened rooms. It never seemed to end well for him when he did. Once he could see clearly enough to make out the individual features of those he had just killed, he felt it was time he headed back out into the forest. There, he would continue with his search for Gagara. He walked slowly to the main gates of the castle, checking his new bow over as he walked. It was a good bow. It would make a nice replacement for the one he had so recently lost. He decided he would keep it. It took Reyes a few seconds to realise that there was some activity over by the castle residency. A group of officers had gathered by the main doors of the residency. They must have been disturbed by the sounds being made by the Harpies trying to kill him, and of the elves cheering them along. Reyes recognised Elder Man Bartinet among them. Also with them were the two officers of Raves Raiders that Reyes had seen at the War Council, the Minotaur and the Elf. Also among the officers were the two that commanded Reyes's own regiment of the Hope, Dragonman Fenert and Wormman Frayne. Strangely enough, these latter two officers, having ensured their own safety during the battle, had changed clothes, and now wore blue uniforms of the regular elven army. Their insignia indicated that they now belonged to the same regiment as the Elderman. Reyes couldn't help but smile to himself. By the look of it, Fenert had finally gotten what he always really wanted, a posting in an elven-only regiment.